guys, so I know it's been a really long time since I've read Chains, but I'm back and I'm ready to keep reading. So if you need a little refresher, you can always go back to my last video to remind yourself a little bit better where we left off. But I'll be starting to read at chapter 15, and the last thing that happened was that Isabel was upstairs, and she heard this blood-curdling scream, and the scream was coming from the kitchen, and so she dropped the bottle and ran to try to figure out what was going on. So we're going to be hopping back in, and just a reminder that each chapter is going to start with a primary source from that time period, and then we'll get into it. So, chapter 15, Saturday, June 22nd, 1776. As for young children liable to be attacked with this distemper, you must begin with giving them wholesome food. Apply to their heads a small plaster of treacle, which must be renewed every 8 days. Let them always have some pleasant and agreeable smells. Let their common drink be aromatized and sweetened with a little cinnamon, anise, coriander, and sugar. And this is from Noel Schomel and Richard Bradley, and it's from a family dictionary containing the most experienced methods for improving estates and preserving of health. So there are going to be different books that are put out about what the best way to take care of health is. Just like today, if you notice something with yourself, you might go to the doctor, or you might just do a little search on the internet to figure out what does that mean. I know I did that the other day. Miss Sophia, my dog, had a little dot in her eye, and so I did a little Google search, and then I called her vet to figure out what's going on, and she's fine. But people are going to have these books around to help figure out what to do if they notice some sort of a health problem. So we might think about, what advice is this giving us, and then is that going to be how they're possibly treating an enslaved person? Probably not. They're not going to be giving them really good smells and a drink that is aromatized, so given nice seasoning, flavoring, and sweetened with cinnamon and sugar and other spices. They're not going to be doing that for an enslaved person. So they're aware at this time period of different things that might help someone with a medical condition, but if you're an enslaved person, you're not going to be treated with those. So we're going to find out what happened. "It's the devil," Madame screamed as I opened the door to the kitchen. Ruth had fallen at her feet and lay there, her body shaking violently. Peas were scattered across the floor. What I feared the most had happened. Madame snatched the broom from Becky's hands and raised it over her head. "She has the devil in her." "No, madam, it's an illness," I cried, "an ailment, nothing more." Madame brought the broom down on the small, twisted body. Ruth couldn't raise her hands to protect herself. The seizure held her fast, her arms and legs stiff and trembling, her eyes wide but not seeing. "Oh, devil!" Madame shouted as she again raised the broom over her head. "No!" I threw myself on top of my sister. The broom came down on my back, once, twice, but it didn't matter. I had to keep her safe until the storm passed. The broom handle cracked, and Madame tossed it aside. I heard Becky yell something, then Lockton's loud voice boomed, "Enough!" So, what clue from this text could we use to determine how hard she was hitting at Ruth with the broom? The broom handle cracked. So we know she's hitting really hard. And we might think about, we read the recommendation, use a nice thing on their head to make sure that they're comfortable, use nice sweet drinks. But instead, this lady is hitting this poor tiny child with a broom when she's having a seizure. The room quieted except for the soft bumping of Ruth's limbs on the floor. I looked up. Madame held a chair, prepared to throw at us. Her husband pulled it out of her hands. Ruth's body suddenly went limp. "What is the meaning of this?" Lockton asked. "She's possessed," Madame sputtered. "I will not have a demon child in my house, Elihu." I ran my hand over Ruth's face and spoke to her softly. Her eyelids fluttered and her mouth moved. "Come back to me, baby girl. Come back, Ruth," I whispered. "Wake up now. It's gone, blown away. Come back, Ruth." She looked confused. She always did after a fit. I helped her sit up. A little blood had soaked through the kerchief at the back of her head where she'd hit the floor. The wound would need some cobwebs. So remember, she's been saving those spider webs to use as a bandage. Lockton sent Becky to the study with the wine. He bade Madam to sit on the chair she had nearly broke over my head, and took a seat himself, and addressed me gravely. "Your sister has the falling sickness," he said. "Does this happen often?" "No, sir." Ruth wiped her tears on my sleeve. "This is not a matter for inquiry," Madam said. "I will not have evil in my house." Becky walked back in, poured cider into a chipped mug, and handed it to Ruth, who took a large mouthful. Madam took a step backward. "The child's curse will poison us all. I want her sold, Elihu. Sold today." "Sold?" "Wife," started Lockton. "You can't sell her," I burst out. "Hold your tongue, girl," Madam commanded. Ruth drank the last of the cider and stood up. Lockton reached out and set his hand on her shoulder. "They are sisters, Anne. One must remember that." "Please, Madam," I said. "She's too little. She'll be hurt." The room fell silent except for the plopping sound of peas falling to the bottom of a wooden bowl. Ruth was picking up the peas she'd spilled. The sound reminded me of pebbles plunking into a deep pond. Becky carried a mug of cider to Madam. "Look there, the little one is already back at her chores, and she did a fine job sweeping earlier." "How often do these fits take hold of her?" Lockton asked me. "Speak truthfully." "Sometimes once a day, sir. Sometimes weeks will go by." "Once a day?" Madam's voice rose again. "Ho, Lockton!" the mayor called from the study. The master studied my sister, then tugged his waistcoat over his belly. "The girl is harmless and useful," he said. "She will work in the kitchen with Becky. That is my decision. Do not disturb me again with womanly prattle." The kitchen fell silent as the master walked away. When we heard the door to the study close, Madam pointed at Ruth. "Don't let her near the milk. She'll curdle it. And don't get used to her presence here. Elihu will soon see reason." She stalked off, leaving a sour smell in the air. Ruth crawled under the table to pick up the peas that had rolled there. I watched her and tried to stop my hands from shaking. What will happen to us? No way of telling. Becky pulled an eel from the basket. It's near impossible to hire help, what with folks running off in fear of the war. She cut off the eel's head. "Long's you two stay out of trouble?" She grabbed the eel's skin at the neck and pulled it all the way off. "I imagine you're safe enough." I bent down to help Ruth with the peas. Whew! Pretty scary, huh? All right, here we go. Next chapter. Sunday, June 23rd, 1776. A report prevails that a most vile, deep-laid plot was yesterday discovered at New York. I have not been able to ascertain the particular facts. However, 40 persons are apprehended and secured. Among them is the mayor of the city. What baseness are our enemy not capable of? Who would wish to be connected with a people so destitute of every virtue? God forbid it should ever be the fate of America. And this is from a letter of Congressional Delegate William Whipple to Joshua Brackett. So we have primary sources from this time period to help us understand all the intrigues of the American Revolution that are happening, how there are spies on this side and spies on that side, and they're telling us that there's a whole group of people that were caught, that there were 40 people arrested for being in this plot to support the British. And it's really interesting to learn about that, to find out how it wasn't necessarily guaranteed that one side was going to win, and we had to really figure out what the best choice for each person was. And you might hear some clicking. That's Miss Sophia walking around over here. She wanted some scratches. All right, here we go. Ruth fell asleep quick that night, my arms around her. I'd washed out the blood from her kerchief and hung it to dry. There was a lump on her head, but it would go away. Madam's threats would not. I slowly pulled my arm out from under my sister. She sighed and curled into a tiny ball. I had pondered the problem all day and half the night. No matter how many times I turned it round, I found the same answer. We had to flee the city. I sat up and pulled the blanket over Ruth, tucking it under her feet to keep them warm. The wings that could spirit us away were hidden in the master's desk. I had to take the list. It would buy us freedom. But Bellingham would not listen, not after the incident with the linen chest. I had to deliver it straight to the army. The sound I had been waiting for broke through, the low roar of Master Lockton's snores, starting up just as the grandfather clock chimed midnight. I put on my skirt and made my way to the bottom of the stairs. The hour was upon me. 'Twas time to act. The moon was my friend. It lit up the library enough for me to make my way without stumbling into anything. The snuff jar stood on the corner of the desk. I held my breath as I lifted the lid, put my hand inside, and slowly pulled out the keys. I crouched behind the desk and examined them in the moonlight. Only one was small enough to fit into the top drawer's lock. I inserted the key and turned it gently to the right. There was a dull clunk. The drawer slid open a hair. I forced myself to remain still and count to 20. Locked-in snores continued above, regular as waves crashing against the side of a ship. I pulled open the drawer and peered inside. It was crowded with abandoned quills, a rusty tinder box, and a few coins and pound notes, which I was sore tempted to take. I felt through the drawer with careful fingers. What had he done with the list? Was it in his coat pocket? I reached into the back of the drawer and pulled out a black hair ribbon. Had he given it to Gold Buttons for safekeeping? There! From the farthest reach of the drawer, I pulled out a single sheet folded once. I held it up to the light and quickly read. It was a list of names, with the mayor's at the bottom. He had titled it, Committee to Preserve the King's Peace. I tucked the paper in my pocket, tied it tight, and slipped it under the waistband of my skirt, where it could not be seen. I closed and relocked the drawer, then carefully returned the keys to their hiding place. I tiptoed back through the house and slipped outside, quiet as a ghost. The air was hot and dripping, as if the city were wrapped in a wool blanket, just pulled from the boiling pot. I made my way along the street, seen only by cats, rats, and a slave hurrying by with a bundle on her head. Since she carried a lantern and no doubt had a pass from her master, she was allowed to be out walking after dark. I was not. The woman said nothing as she passed by me, but started singing the second verse of Yankee Doodle in a strong voice, which I thought curious indeed. I listened close to the words. Father and I went down to camp along with Captain Gooding, and there we saw the men and boys, thick as hasty pudding. She was sending me a message. I dove behind a log barricade just as two soldiers turned the corner, talking intently to each other and sweeping the street with their eyes. I said a quick prayer of thanks to the singing woman for help. So this enslaved woman couldn't do much to warn her, but how did she warn her? What did she do? Yeah. So these freedom fighters are going to be helping each other out any way that they can. She can tell that this other young girl that's out probably doesn't have a pass, and she's sneaking along the edges. And so it's just a really powerful way that people are going to try to help each other. That I love how Lori Halls Anderson has woven into this narrative. That we may never get to find that other woman's story, but we know that she looked out for our main character. When the echoes of the soldiers' boots had vanished, I moved on, staying away from the lights of the sentry fires, passing under the dark shadow of King George's statue in the Bowling Green, and hurrying to my destination. So, something in our current events today, people are removing statues that they feel no longer represent our ideals or feel that they are sending the right message. And we know at this time period, in this location, there's a statue of King George III there. And later on in the Revolution, they are going to be tearing down that statue. So it's not something that just sticks with history, that people take down statues then. Today it's happening. And it says a lot about our society and who we are as a people, what statues we have up, who do we feel are important enough to be represented in a statue. And so from time to time, people are going to re-examine that and say, maybe not so much that person, or, ooh, we need to make a new statue for that one. So it might be kind of fun for you to be thinking about, if you got to decide to have a statue in your town, what do you want as that? What would be a really good thing to make a monument of? It might be kind of a fun project. The battery was the fort at the southern tip of the island, with high walls and cannons that pointed over the water to discourage enemies. It was the headquarters of the Patriot Army in New York. Even if General Washington was elsewhere, here I could find an officer who would understand the value of the list. I marched past the rows of tents set upon the grounds outside the fort, trying very hard to ignore the men and boys who stared as I walked by. As I neared the gate, a sentry stepped out and blocked my way. "Do you have a pass, girl?" I swallowed hard and tried to remember the name of the colonel who worked with Master Bellingham. Fagin, Jaden, McRaden. Well, a few other soldiers drinking coffee outside their tents had stopped talking to observe. "Please, sir," I said, polite and firm, "I've come with an urgent message for Reagan, for Colonel Reagan, sir. Tell me, and I'll see that he gets it." "I cannot," I said. "I must deliver it to him personally, sir." "Who's your master?" Telling a lie would not benefit me. "A loyalist, sir, who would beat me bloody if he knew I was here." He looked over me and yawned. Come on, then. I could do with a walk to keep me awake. I followed him inside past a room of men sleeping on the floor, along a hall to a small room, where a low fire smoldered in the hearth, a chair drawn up before it. The moonlight had broke free of the clouds again and lay in great gray pools beneath the windows. A table stood by the door, where a heavy-set man scratched away on a piece of paper, his work lit by a half-dozen candle stubs that would soon be burnt out. The soldier drew himself up to his full height. This girl has a message, sir. Claims it must be delivered in person. The man lifted his hand in the air and continued with what he was writing. I tried to make out what it was, but his scribble was dreadful bad. Finally, he laid down his quill, moved his spectacles high in his nose, and peered through them at me. What is it? He rasped. His voice sounded raw, like it had been run against a grater. An onion poultice was tied around his neck. I dropped in a polite curtsy. I have information for Colonel Reagan. Who sent you? Who's your master? I cannot say. Then who will vouch for you? Ah, I vouch for myself, sir. I am new in the city and only know a boy named Kirsten. One caterpillar eyebrow lifted above the glasses as he recognized the name. Bellingham's Kirsten? He coughed loudly and sprayed drops of spittle on the page. He's all bluster. He dipped his quill in the ink pot and continued to write. Take her away, Sergeant. I am too busy for this. My escort grabbed hold of my arm. Come now. I tried to break free. Please, hear me out. I shook my arm and twisted. They want to kill him. I pulled with all my might and lost my footing. Both the sergeant and me stumbled against the table. The ink bottle overturned and poured across the table and papers. The sick man jumped up with a mighty curse and several ugly statements about my character. They want to kill the general. I finally pulled free of the sergeant's grasp. I have proof. The man was concerned only with rescuing his papers from the spreading pool of ink. Sergeant, remove this bird wit. Do not touch her. The commanding voice came from the center of the room. The sergeant stood at attention. The man with inky hands did too, swallowing hard and wincing at the pain in his throat. A figure rose from the high-backed chair that stood in front of the hearth. He wore the dark blue coat of an officer, with buttons and buckles that reflected the firelight. His features stayed in the shadows, but I could see a book in his left hand, a finger marking the page. Leave us, he ordered. Yes, sir, the sergeant said. As you wish, Colonel Reagan, sir. And the man, whose clothes were stained blue by the papers, he clutched to his chest. When the door was pulled behind them, Colonel Reagan returned to his seat. Come here, he told me. Show me what you've brought and tell your story, but keep your voice low. The walls have ears. So I want you to think, what does that mean, the walls have ears? We talked in class about how, does it really mean that there are ears all over the wall? Or what else could it mean? That people are listening. So there are spies everywhere. People are always looking for information to trade, and he wants to keep this very private. I want to go back to the beginning a little bit when she first came into this tent. Notice how they asked, well, who can vouch for you? Who can say that you're someone who's worthy of being trusted? They asked for her master. So they're not seeing this person, this freedom fighter, Isabel, in her own right, as a woman who has information and is trying to help them. They're only seeing her as property. And that's going to be something on both sides of the war. So she's trying to make her best choice for her and her sister. Who can she trust? What information can she use for her benefit to protect her family? And they're not even seeing her as a human. They're seeing her as someone's property that they couldn't possibly trust on her own. Yes, sir. My voice strangulated a bit. The colonel tugged at his coat as he sat down. He was not wearing a wig, as most gentlemen did. His own hair was dark, pulled back into a neat queue, and tied with string. His eyes were sunk deep into his face, with dark hollows underneath them. Well, he set the book on his lap, fingers still marking the place left off reading. I weighed my words before I spoke. I am in a position to trade with you, sir. What kind of trade? My sister and I were wrongfully taken from Rhode Island. I mean to get us back there. You want passage home in exchange for what you know? Yes, I said, lifting my chin a little. Sir. He nodded gravely. If your information is as useful as you think it is, I shall personally look into your case, miss. That was far from a birth of a swift ship, but I had little choice. They planned to kill General Washington. He closed the book, set it on the floor, and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Tell me all. I handed him the list and quickly told him everything I knew. He interrupted a few times with questions and had me repeat the mayor's words. Then he bade me to wait by the dying fire as he left the room, and soon reappeared with 4 other men, all clearly dragged from their beds. I was fighting to stay awake myself, but I repeated the story to the larger assembly. A quarrel began instantly, the arguments flying across the room. How do we know the Locktons didn't send her with a false story? That's just a list of names. Anyone could have written it. I know the mayor's handwriting, and those are dyed-in-the-wool loyalists. Every one. I don't believe they've turned a lifeguard. Those men are the finest we have. This is nonsense, and I'm going back to bed. Her story confirms what we've heard from other sources. This from Colonel Reagan. He explained that several spies had brought him the same rumor earlier in the day. He walked to the hearth and looked at the glowing embers. All that remains is to decide what to do with the information. Who has the list? A man wearing his uniform coat over his nightshirt waved the paper in the air. Return it to the girl. Why on earth would we do that? He asked. I want her to plant it back where she found it. 'Tis best they believe their plan is still secret. That improves our chances of rounding them up. The man handed the list back to me. I thought for a moment about tossing it in the fire, for it suddenly seemed frightful dangerous, but I folded it back in my pocket. Do you think you'll be able to return it to his desk? Colonel Reagan asked me. Yes, sir, I said. If you hear anything else, anything at all, you come and find me. Do you understand? Yes, sir, I hesitated. And you'll soon help my sister and me get home? His eyes darted to his companions, then back to me. I shall do what's in my power, he promised. Thank you, sir. She'll need the code to get back into camp, said the man in the nightshirt. The new regulations are out at dawn. Agreed. Colonel Reagan bent down so that his face was level with mine. Do not tell this to another soul, on pain of death. Do you swear? I swear, I whispered. The code is Ad Astra. Repeat it, please. Ad Astra? I'd never heard such a word, but then again, I'd never before spoken in code. 2 words. Ad Astra. It's Latin. It means to the stars. Will you be able to remember it? I never forget a thing, sir. So we have our code, Ad Astra, to the stars, and that's going to be where I'm going to pause for today. I might do a little bit more reading in a bit, give my voice a break, but I hope you like it, and she's so brave. Oh my goodness. All right, I'll see you guys later.